Dominique. Here's our first question. Until recently, a social or antisocial behavior has been thought of and dealt with in legal terms. Prisoners, the confined, the criminally insane, etc. More and more, they are thought of and dealt with in clinical terms. The emotionally disturbed, mentally ill, psychopathic, etc. To what does this evolution due? Donzelet. The formulation of this question bothers me. I would say the opposite. Isn't it putting the cart before the horse to speak of a social or antisocial behavior when the behavior is first determined by a certain institutional distribution? People who are placed in institutions are there in compliance with a power relation, which the legal and the clinical only confirm, since they go hand in hand. Foucault. I would like to make a small historical point. I don't know if it will change the position of the problem. I think, as Donzelet does, that legal categories of exclusion usually do have their medical or clinical correlatives. What is deceptive is that legal terms, for a number of reasons, are rather stable and constant, whereas clinical categories are relatively unstable and have changed rapidly. It is true that the notion of emotional disturbance is recent, but that does not mean that legal clinical doubling or the reuse of a legal category in a clinical category is a recent phenomenon. Because before emotionally disturbed people, there were degenerates, and before degenerates, there were monomaniacs, and these notions are as much legal as medical. On the one hand, there was a great police sorting out process which, I believe, began in the West in the 15th century, namely, the hunting down of vagrants, beggars, and the idle. This practice of police selection, exclusion, and imprisonment remained outside the field of the judicial legal practice. The Paris Parliament was in charge of policing vagrants and beggars in the capital for a number of years, but this was soon relinquished, and institutions and apparatus, completely different from the normal legal apparatus, assumed these duties. And then at the beginning of the 19th century, the police enforcement of social selection was reintegrated into the judicial practice, because in the Napoleonic state, police, justice, and penitential institutions were linked to each other. And just as these practices were being integrated into the judicial, thus police practice, new psychological, psychiatric, and sociological categories appeared at the same time in order to justify them, to double them, to give them another reading, not to give them another readability. Meyer. Then two remarks. The difference, it seems, between the emotionally disturbed person of today and the degenerate of the past is that the degenerate did not call for a whole host of experts on relations, rehabilitation, readjustment, etc. Moreover, you say that there was a first penal apparatus and that this was then doubled by the psychiatric apparatus. Isn't it currently the reverse? Foucault. I agree with you. It is certain that the interplay between the penal and the psychiatric, the legal and the psychological, has certainly changed a lot in the past 150 years. But I think nevertheless that both are born of social practices, those of selection, of exclusion, that they were both born of police practices that were integrated into the legal world rather late. When you say, now there are experts in charge of treating the emotionally disturbed, whereas the degenerates were not treatable, you're absolutely right. But around 1820 to 1830, just as large prisons and large psychiatric hospitals came into being, when juries had to deal with parricide or the murder of a child, the jurors were in an awkward position. They had to choose between the prison and the hospital, two solutions that were ultimately fairly equivalent. The problem was, the guy had to be locked up in any case. What sort of confinement would be the most secure? That of the prison or the hospital? Doctor-police communication is long-standing. Virilio. There's something very interesting to me in what Foucault just said, that societry preceded psychiatry. That interests me because where are the asylums today? Are they closed? Are they open? If you look at what has recently happened in Great Britain with the House of Commons' decision to abolish all asylums within 20 years, this is very important. We're back to the situation you describe in Madness and Civilization, in the Middle Ages, before confinement. But not under exactly the same conditions. That is, the mad, the deviants, are freed to roam the territory, but this time the territory is completely controlled, contrary to the medieval period. What do you think of this notion of societry, in the largest sense of the word, preceding psychiatry? Foucault. The House of Commons' decision is indeed remarkable. It is even stupefying, and I wonder if they know where it will lead, unless they realize very well where it won't lead. Because capitalist societies, and until now societies that call themselves non-capitalist as well, are nevertheless confining societies. If one classified societies according to how they got rid not of their dead but of their living, one would have a classification of massacre societies or murder ritual societies, exile societies, reparations societies, and confinement societies. These seem to me to be the four main types. That capitalist society is a confinement society is a fact that I think has been very difficult to explain. Why indeed is it necessary for this society, where the workforce is sold, to be a confining society? Idleness, vagrancy, the migrations of those seeking better salaries elsewhere, all of this leads to the control of this mass, the possibility of putting it back on the employment market. All this is inscribed in the very practice of confinement, so that when a society, even a capitalist one, like the English society, declares that there is no longer confinement, at least for the mad, I ask myself this: does this mean that the other great half of confinement, the prison, will disappear? Or is it that, on the contrary, it will occupy the space left vacant by the asylum? Is England not doing the opposite of what the Soviet Union is in the process of doing? The USSR is generalizing the psychiatric hospital. It is making it assume the role of prisons. Won't England be led to expand the function of prisons, even if they are tremendously improved? Donzelet. It doesn't seem to me to be a matter of eliminating confinement. I simply think that it has been devalued, and that we are witnessing an outward diffusion of confinement procedures that preserves places of confinement as a resting point, reducing the prison, but on the basis of a system of control and surveillance meant to keep people in their place, which would have the same function. Foucault. That's why your question interested me very much, with some qualifications. If one reduces the problem to these two terms, the legal and the psychological, one ends up saying this: either psychological discourse reveals the truth of what legal practice did blindly, a positivist conception that you find very frequently among medical historians and psychologists when they say to you, "What do you think witches were?" They were neurotics. Or else, if one does a purely relativist analysis, one admits that the legal and the psychological are two readings of one and the same phenomenon, a reading that in the 19th century was above all legal, that in the 20th is psychological, without the psychological being better founded than the legal. As for me, I would introduce a third term that I would specifically call police, a practice that is selective, exclusive, confining, etc., upon which legal, psychological, etc. practices and discourses are built. Donzelet. Before one proceeded with the means at hand, and that was exclusion. But now there is a very good system, which is relegation through the school. School, as well as we all know, allows people to remain in place that has been assigned them according to the demands of the system, and this according to their social origin. There is a book that discusses this very well, the École Capitale en France. It talks about two school networks, the high school college network and the pre-professional network. There is perhaps a third, which would be the legal clinical network, a sort of new layer, a new educative strata that is being set up in order to absorb the old products of exclusion somewhat. There would therefore be a sort of dialectic, though I don't like that word very much, between exclusion and relegation. When things are fine, when one has the means, relegation is done through schooling. When that is not enough, one resorts to exclusion. To me, that is the whole problem. It's not more complicated than that. Julliard. In short, confinement, as we understand it, is a substitute for previous closed societies. As these societies open up, they no longer have the sorts of internal regulations that pre-capitalist societies had, and at that moment we have types of confinement such as the asylum and the prison. Foucault. That was an important technique in the growth of capitalism, much more so in fact than at its budding stage. Meyer. I do not agree with Donzelette when he says it doesn't matter whether emphasis is placed on penality or psychiatry. As long as law finds its expression in a legal form, in the largest sense of the word, transgression is possible, definable, perhaps even called for, in a way, if one accepts Mauss's reasoning on taboo. It's different when law is expressed and transmitted in a way that above all concerns what is unspoken. I'll give an example. The incest taboo. It is actually written in the penal code. It happened rather late, I think, and in any case, no one ever taught us that it was forbidden to sleep with one's mother, father, brother, or little sister. On the one hand, hitting them on the head or treating them badly is something we were constantly told not to do. The greatest difficulty of transgression within a social group concerns the implicit norm. The fact that we have passed from social control that took on legal and penal aspects to social control that takes on clinical or therapeutic aspects leads us to a diffusion of the norm and to a control of the norm that escapes the representation and apprehension of both individuals and the community. I think this is how the treatment of deviance has been socialized, and this seems to me to be a negative socialization, a socialization in the same sense of control, but this time much more grave. Dominique. This is the direction of our second question. Social work is constantly increasing its scope. It started as volunteer work to help eradicate tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases, and became professional social assistance in underprivileged or paraproletarian environments. Today it is widely established in companies' administrations. Its most recent evolution has led it to take charge of community activities in, quote, ordinary populations, particularly in cities. Do you think this growth and evolution of social work has a relation to the nature and evolution of our economic system? Is there really a continuity between the social work that stemmed from the police, psychiatric, or rehabilitative treatment of deviance, and social action among the mass population? What do we call social work today? Thibaud. For about 10 years, we have been emerging more and more from a, quote, welfare state. That is, from a certain economy mostly controlled by the state whose professed social goal is full employment. When there is work for everyone and blind belief in growth is accepted, the economic sphere can be the general mode of control of society. With the opening of borders, the formation of multinational companies, the emphasis on competitive capabilities, etc., full employment is no longer the basis of the economic credo at all. Not only does unemployment increase, but phenomena like overeducation, in relation to what the production or the innumerable social nuances require, manifest a sort of detachment of the economic from the social. Thus, the social has to be controlled or made to exist independently, by its own means and not through the economy which goes its own way. Between production and the population, a gulf is created. A new terrain of debates and conflicts appear. The outcome could just as well be more control as more autonomy. Donzelette. The welfare system that had relative autonomy is now systemically tied to the legal. There is a continuity from custody aid, court assistance, etc. So roughly speaking, we have the following two facts. A considerable number of agents increasingly dependent on the legal apparatus, and the diffusion of a systemic model of interpretation of human problems, which is psychologism, but which functions above all ideologically. Trenton. What makes you say the social workers are linked to the legal system? Donzelette. Laws. Trenton. Absolutely not. Meyer. If you want a number, take from a recent survey. 50% of social workers are directly paid by the state and 19% paid by Social Security. That makes 69% paid by the state or Social Security. The least we can say is that we are moving toward a grouping of forces. Virilio. I thought we should reflect on social assistance that is developing and starting to enter new sectors. Couldn't we question the legitimacy of this? You talk as though this were self-evident. These 90,000 social workers, these health identity cards, this psychiatric overseeing of the territory, community policing, this generalized surveillance by every means, electronic and otherwise. For me, this is a problem. The Bode. I did not say that this was self-evident at all. I simply said that before asserting that social workers are in the service of the police, the question still had to be asked. What do social workers do? And I wanted to protest against the answer that was immediately given. Social workers are workers for the cops. I said, this has to be looked at more closely. Take the case of Madame d'Escrivon, the social worker in the Fresnes prison. She was dismissed by the penal administration because she had denounced the mistreatment of a prisoner. She was therefore not in the service of the police. This is not a matter of shoving people into drawers. Foucault. Nevertheless, when you give us, as an example of social workers not being employed by the police, the fact that Madame d'Escrivon was sent packing on police orders with the support of the Red Cross, I think this is a topical example of the way power prescribes social work in our society. I think some individuals in that situation say no and take to the offensive, as Madame Rose and Madame d'Escrivon did. This does not prevent their expulsion, and the fact that their expulsion was accepted by everyone, not only, of course, by the administration, but by their colleagues, proves how programmed and determined social work currently is. Juilliard. I think the word police has created a false debate. Indeed, the case of prison, the connection to the police, which is a particularly operational instrument of coercion, is very clear. If you take teachers at the point we're at now, they could be considered social workers. You see that a growing number of them find that aside from their explicit function, which is communication, they have an implicit function, which is the maintenance of order. And it seems to me the problem today comes from the fact that this implicit function becomes explicit for a number of people, insofar as they realize that some of the actions they would like to carry out in order to fulfill their explicit, necessary, and legitimate function brings them to question what remains implicit in it. And then they come up against the external authority which indeed determines them, and which, I don't want to say manipulates them, that would be too strong, but which is their guarantor in the last analysis. Puchat. But then is a counsel inevitably a police officer in current society? Meyer. No, but the mandate he receives is that of a controller. Virilio. And he reinforces the harmful assumption that we can no longer counsel ourselves and recreate ourselves. That's terrible. It's trading favors. That's the whole problem. This accusation on the basis of supposed intentions which the social worker implicitly makes against us through his function, through the mass of social workers, this accusation we cannot accept. This is the problem of social work. We act as if society didn't create itself, as if it were treated, acted upon only from the outside. It seems as though we go through three states: the self-regulation of primitive societies, the regulation of our societies, and that we are headed toward a sort of deregulation through the urbanization you spoke of just now, which in itself is a new phenomenon since now we talk about world cities. Foucault. I would like to add a word to what Juilliard was saying. It is obvious that we never said that such and such social worker, the social worker as an individual, was salaried by the police. It is absolutely not the case. I think, on the other hand, what is important is that social work is inscribed within a larger function which for centuries has not ceased to take on new dimensions, which is the function of surveillance correction. Surveilling individuals and correcting them, in both senses of the term, that is punishing them or teaching them. This function of surveillance correction was ensued even in the 19th century by various institutions, by the church among others, then by school teachers. We say that the social worker started out as a volunteer to help eradicate tuberculosis and venereal disease. I wonder if his origin is not rather in the function of the educator, the institutor, properly speaking. He indeed had that role next to the priest, opposite the priest, against the priest, The republic developed through their opposition. In the 19th century, this function of surveillance correction was relatively autonomous in relation to political power. Political power played on their opposition, their conflicts, their autonomy, and now it is overseeing this again very closely, and all the more rigorously now that the church on the one hand and intellectuals on the other are beginning to elude its grasp. The great betrayal of intellectuals in terms of the bourgeois state is sanctioned by the fact that social workers are being made to play the role that, for some time now, the school teacher, the high school teacher, the intellectual no longer play. The paradox being that these social workers are trained by these intellectuals. Hence the fact that the social worker can't help betraying the function that has been assigned. Damanak. The political meaning of social work is to be determined in terms of another problem, which our third question raises. How do we situate in social theory those who are currently considered maladjusted? Problems or subjects? Capitalism's army reserve or the revolutions? Trenton. Most social workers are experiencing a sort of malaise now, because they are beginning to realize that they are contributing most of the time implicitly and without wanting to the maintenance of order. So there is an internal tension, hence a consciousness of the fact that to act on the individual level is absolutely illusory as long as certain political problems are not addressed. Meyer. Let's take the example of delinquents. I did preventative work for 3 years in an underprivileged environment. What one finds in Marx and Engels is not particularly soft on the underclass. Do we have to accept this? Do we have to accept this Marxist logic, namely that the best thing that can happen to young subproletarians is to become proletarians? Juilliard. You've stated the question very well. A reading of Marxism, which is, alas, probably the correct one, will consider these problems as very marginal, insofar as social, political, and trade union action, as deduced from Marxism, rests on the same type of logic as capitalism itself, that is, the defense or the will to take over a part of the surplus value. If one situates oneself within this universe, one understands very well why Marx and Engels were not interested in the subproletariat, because it's not a producer of surplus. Thus, it's not a social agent and not to be defended as such. The subproletariat is, in their eyes, a byproduct of the overall society, its dominant part as well as its dominated part. This logic, this productivist logic, is what we're presently questioning. Nevertheless, the problem still remains of knowing if the marginals, the delinquents, the prisoners, the mentally ill, etc., can become one of the essential agents of political action or not. If the goal of political action remains the taking or the exercise of power, it can only be the act of groups that are significant in society, that is, producers, those who have a precise social or economic function. Only we are discovering that there are no longer the marginals and the producers, but that a growing number of producers are becoming marginal, one after another. That is, they are experiencing different forms of exclusion, and this is perhaps where there is a possibility of bringing the real marginal into social and political action, which would be that of all workers. Donzelet. I agree with this process of dividing up and categorizing people in general, but ultimately I think we would have to look at the fundamental dividing lines. There is one that is decisive, the one that separates the honorable, working, trade union proletariat from the ignoble, imprisoned, non-trade union proletariat. And indeed, this dividing line is what makes the functioning of the economic and political system possible. It is fundamental. Foucault. I agree with your analysis of Marx, but where I don't follow you is when you say, here's the proletariat on one side, and on the other, the marginals, and you have gathered under this rubric, it was not an exhaustive list, prisoners, the mentally ill, delinquents, etc. So can one define the non-proletarian, non-proletarianized plebeian by the list of the mentally ill, the delinquent, the imprisoned? Shouldn't we say instead that there is a split between the proletariat on the one hand and the extra-proletarian, non-proletarianized plebeian on the other? We should not say, here's the proletariat and then there are these marginals. We should say, there is the overall mass of the plebeians, a split between the proletariat and the non-proletarianized plebeian. And I think that institutions like the police, the courts, the penal system are some of the ways that are constantly used to deepen this rift which capitalism needs. Because basically what capitalism is afraid of, rightly or wrongly, since 1789, since 1848, since 1870, is insurrection and riot. The guys who take to the streets with their knives and their guns, who are ready for the direct and violent action. The bourgeoisie was haunted by this vision, and it wants to let the proletariat know this is no longer possible, saying it is not in your own interest to ally yourselves with people ready to spearhead your insurrections. And all this mobile population prepared to take to the streets to cause riots, these people were held up in a way as negative examples by the penal system, and all the legal and moral devalorization of violence, of theft, etc. All this moral education that the teacher gave in positive terms to the proletariat, the courts provide in negative terms. This is how the rift was constantly reproduced and reintroduced between the proletariat and the non-proletarianized world, because it was assumed that contact between the two was a dangerous foment of riots. Juilliard. I agree enough to say that, from this point of view, the Marxist perspective must be broken with, which is centered solely on the producer. Trenton. Marxist and Darwinist because 19th century bourgeois thought was profoundly marked by Darwinism, and in that respect, Marx and Darwin concur. The lumpen proletariat in Marxist theory is a sort of residue. I totally agree with your analysis there. The courts, the police do their best to stigmatize the lumpen proletariat, but social workers, in this case, do the opposite. Generally, perhaps, the social worker maintains a certain social order, but social work breaks totally, in its technique and in its spirit, with the process and procedure of stigmatization. We have to look at how social work developed. It was not born in France, but in the Anglo-Saxon countries, in reaction against Darwinist thought, which was, let them all croak, otherwise you're going against the order of nature. Historically, that was it, and I think the techniques of social work have precisely consisted of trying to reintegrate the lumpen proletariat through the individual action, but simultaneously of attenuating or erasing the border based on stigmatization. Donzelot. The function of all apparatus, of all authority, is to mark out a territory and establish limits, to divide things up. The function of social assistance is this, to divide things up. A family which a social assistant has visited is a family designated as belonging to a certain rejected or disposable population, whose participation is no longer wanted because it is already outside the law. Foucault. There are two ways of erasing the dividing line between the non-proletarianized plebeian and the proletariat. One is to address the proletarianized plebeian and to inculcate in it a certain number of values, principles, norms, so that it accepts unquestioningly values that are ultimately bourgeois values, which are also in many cases values that the bourgeois has inculcated in the proletariat, thanks to which the plebeian finds itself disarmed, since it will have lost its specificity in the face of the proletariat, and will cease to be dangerous as a ferment, a center of riots, of possible insurrection for the bourgeoisie. There is another way to bypass the division, which is to say to the proletariat and to the plebeian at the same time, what is this system of values being inculcated in you, if not precisely a system of power, an instrument of power in the hands of the bourgeoisie? When you are told that stealing is bad, you are given a certain definition of private property, which is accorded a certain value in the bourgeoisie. When you are taught not to like violence, to be for peace, to not want vengeance, to prefer justice to struggle, what are you being taught? You are being taught to prefer bourgeois justice to social struggle. You are being taught that it is better to have a judge than vengeance. This is the work that intellectuals and school teachers have done to great effect, and this is the work that social workers on their level are continuing. Trenton. This type of alliance between proletarians and subproletarian is absolutely traditional in periods of violent revolution. Only it's an ephemeral alliance. Once past the period of vacillation, which accompanies the substitution of one power for another, traditional exclusion returns. The heroes of the riot find themselves in prison. The question seems therefore to conclude an alliance between the proletariat and subproletariat based on something besides values of revolt, on a common social project, without which, after the day of rage, the alliance will prove ephemeral, a deception as usual. Foucault. When I said that the problem was precisely to show the proletariat that the justice system being proposed to it, being imposed on it, is in fact an instrument of power, it was precisely so that this alliance with the plebeian not be simply a tactical alliance for one day or night, but that between the proletariat, which absolutely does not have the same ideology as the plebeian, and a plebeian which absolutely does not have the social practices of the proletariat, there could actually be something else besides a meeting of circumstances. Donzelot. I think the place where this meeting between the insurgent plebeian and the proletariat subjected to bourgeois values can happen is on the extra-professional level, on the level of housing problems, unemployment, life in certain neighborhoods, isolation, on the level of health problems, on the level of confronting police control. The link can be made on all of this. Virilio. Juilliard just said that the margin is becoming massive and we're not talking about it, while the state seems to have envisaged it through the development of social work. As soon as the margin becomes massive, classic police treatment will be impossible, or else it will be civil war. The only possible treatment, especially since the intelligentsia fled, let's say after 1968, is to repatriate the popular ideologists who are social workers. With the crisis not only of capitalist society, but also industrial society, the real question is this: what happens if marginalization becomes a mass phenomenon? Just now we gave the characteristics of this abandoned anomic segment of the population. In the 19th century, it was a tiny segment of society. Let's admit that now these characteristics apply to millions of people in the suburbs of the continental metropolises we just spoke of. Foucault. I would like to ask a question. What if it is the mass that marginalizes itself? That is, if it is precisely the proletariat and the young proletarians that refuse the ideology of the proletariat. At the same time that the margins become massive, the masses might well marginalize themselves. Contrary to what we expected, the people who go before the courts are not really all unemployed. They are young workers who say, why should I sweat my whole life for $2,000 a month when I could whatever? At that point, it's the mass that is becoming marginal. Meyer. When a young proletarian marginalizes himself, he ends up in court sooner or later, or at a psychiatrist's. The court will consider the penal dimension of his marginalization, the psychiatrist the individual dimension. Who will make him aware of the political dimension of this marginalization? Surely not the so-called social worker, who only intervenes on the psychiatrist or the judge's underling. Certain militant groups like the GIP, Group for Information on Prisons, allowed the underclass and their families to situate themselves socially and politically, to know who their allies and who their adversaries were. Wasn't this sort of GIP action at once a critique of social work and a critique of political militarism? Donzelot. Indeed, on two levels there is a refusal of the classical militant practice. First, classic militantism was systemically pedagogical. The GIP only gives people the means to express themselves, restores a certain amount of expressive possibilities. Second, emphasis is placed on divisions within the proletariat and not on unification, whose rhetoric has occupied the political arena for the past 150 fucking years. Juilliard. Do you find that very positive politically? On the first count, okay, it's a matter of letting people express themselves, rather than instructing them. But when you say, let's stress the differences rather than the pseudo-unanimity that might exist between them, I wonder is this not politically very demobilizing? Your action could end up being a safety valve for society as a whole. I tend to think that only insofar as working classes and dangerous classes can come together will something be possible. This is not easy at all. This implies that the working class, who I think remain determinate, come to see themselves as something other than productive classes. That is, that they arrive at a universal awareness that their position as a productive class is prohibitive. For as productive classes, they are only a segment of society, which necessarily complements some and excludes others, as you pointed out. So far as the productive class, that is ultimately the majority of the population, considers the problems of the marginals as its own, in different forms, not all marginals are represented by delinquency or mental illness. Can this function come to be? Yet market society imposes increasingly specific and increasingly demanding social models of behavior and consumption. If you don't look like a young, dynamic 30-year-old executive, married with 2 children and good social standing, you are potentially a marginal. Insofar as the social model becomes increasingly rigorous and increasingly exclusive, producers as a whole could refuse it and come to a new type of universality by considering the problems of the marginal as their own, that we are all German Jews if you prefer. Donzelot. We are not all German Jews. We are not all homosexuals. We do not all want to be. We are not all this or that. These are forms that, as such, have to be expressed. And I think types of political action and political movements were always conceived on a religious model. That is, people unified on the basis of transcendental values and not on the basis of real fucking life. Of this or that real problem. Of theirs. We do not stress opposition in order to engender differences, but precisely that. Once differences are recognized, the alliances that are concluded are real alliances, and not mythical fucking alliances that end in the usual